Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. As you can see, I am still here sheltering in place, here in Chicago. I hope all is well wherever you are. So thanks for joining us today. And today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today I'm actually going to combine two topic suggestions from commenters Samir Ibrahim and Dale Pride. Samir requested a video on the history of the Hobbits and why they are so resistant to the ring. And Dale Pride asked for the history of Gladden Fields. And those two topics intertwine a bit, so I thought I'd handle them both. First off, it should be noted that Tolkien considered himself a hobbit. That's how high in his estimation hobbits were. And here's a quote about it from one of his letters. I am in fact a hobbit in all but size. I like gardens, trees, and unmechanized farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food, unrefrigerated, but detest French cooking. I like, and even dare to wear in these dull days, ornamental waistcoats. I am fond of mushrooms out of a field, have a very simple sense of humor which even my appreciative critics find tiresome. I go to bed late and get up late when possible. I do not travel much. I love Wales, what is left of it when mines and even more ghastly seaside resorts have done their worst, and especially the Welsh language. So there you go. You see this appreciation for hobbitdom. Tolkien wrote himself into these characters. Waistcoats, the love of nature, the love of good food, the dislike of industrialization. These are all things that he put into hobbits that he himself had strong feelings about. In fact, you can see how important hobbits are to him in that the prologue for Lord of the Rings has a lot of really useful information about hobbits. Now, first few times I read Lord of the Rings, I was kind of like, I want to get to the story, and I'm going to skip the prologue. But once I actually stopped to read it, it actually had some really good information in it. So I suggest you do the same if you've skipped the prologue like I did once upon a time. But here you go. Here's a little information about hobbits that you find some of the first words in the Lord of the Rings. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. Even in ancient days they were, as a rule, shy of big folk, as they call us. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently, when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by. And this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never in fact studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice, and a close friendship with the earth, have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races. A little hint about our hobbit friends, and we'll see a little bit later a reference to this act of them disappearing seeming magical. But yes, in fact, they're just good at not being seen when they don't want to be seen. So as much as they may seem like a race unto themselves, like elves, dwarves, humans, they are considered a sub-branch of humans, the world of men. Hence, they probably awoke when the first men awoke, way back in the First Age, so, thousands and thousands of years before the War of the Ring, where humanity first awoke was in a region called Hildorian, which was in the far eastern portion of Middle-earth. Eventually, the tribes of men all came west, and we can assume the hobbits did the same. Now, all of that is an educated guess, because the hobbits don't technically appear in Tolkien's mythology until the year 1050 of the Third Age. What we learn at this time is that hobbits have currently formed 3 different tribes, and they're all living in an area called the Vales of the Anduin. I would guess that Once upon a time, back in that first age, when they were journeying west along with humanity, they reached the Misty Mountains, big giant mountain range in front of them, and thought, this'll do. I think we've gone far enough. Look, there's green lands, there's rivers, it's fertile soil. We'll just stay here, thanks. And so they didn't cross the mountains, stayed there at the Vales of the Anduin, which includes the Gladden Fields, hence what we'll be talking about a little bit later. But though they all lived in generally the same region, the Vales of the Anduin, each of these three tribes formed their own community. I'm going to read you another section here from the prologue. It's going to mention something about crossing the mountains. Obviously, eventually, the hobbits do cross the mountains to get to the Shire. But at this point, they're still in the Vales of the Anduin, 1050 of the Third Age. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stewards, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stewards were broader, heavier in build. Their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others. They were lovers of trees and of woodlands. So I'll put up a map here, but generally speaking, the Fallowhides lived the farthest north in the Vales of the Anduin, kind of in the region near where Beorn's house is at the time of The Hobbit. Just south of them were the Harfoots, and then farthest south were the Stewards, and those are the ones who lived in this Gladden Fields area. And spoiler alert, a little bit later, that's where we find Gollum. It's noted that the Tooks were a famous, influential Fallowhide family. So Peregrine Took, Pippin, has a Fallowhide influence in his upbringing. Now, you're going to find out as we talk later that there's an intermingling of these three tribes, so there's probably a little bit of all three tribes in everybody. But I would say Pippin is primarily Fallowhide in origin. The Tooks obviously intermarried with our Baggins side of the family, so Bilbo and Frodo are a mixture of Harfoots and Fallowhides. Sam is probably mostly a Harfoot, known for their hairy feet. And Merry probably has some Stewar in him, because the Stewards took up in the Buckland region, and they liked rivers. And obviously Sméagol / Gollum was a Stewar as well. I could only find one paragraph that alludes to the hobbits pre-1050 of the Third Age. And that passage is in the Two Towers. It's when King Theoden meets Merry and Pippin for the first time at Isengard. And we hear a little bit about the legends of hobbits past. "It cannot be doubted that we witnessed the meeting of dear friends," said Theoden. "So these are the lost ones of your company, Gandalf? The days are fated to be filled with marvels. Already I have seen many since I left my house. And now, here, before my eyes, stand yet another of the folk of legend. Are not these the halflings that some among us call the Holbitlan?" "Hobbits, if you please, lord," said Pippin. "Hobbits," said Theoden. "Your tongue is strangely changed, but the name sounds not unfitting, so. Hobbits." Pippin got up and bowed low. "You are gracious, lord, or I hope that I may so take your words," he said. "And here is another marvel. I have wandered in many lands since I left my home, and never till now have I found people that knew any story concerning hobbits." "My people came out of the north long ago," said Theoden. "But I will not deceive you. We know no tales about hobbits. All that is said among us is that far away, over many hills and rivers, live the halfling folk that dwell in holes in sand dunes. But there are no legends of their deeds, for it is said that they do little and avoid the sight of men, being able to vanish in a twinkling, and they can change their voices to resemble the piping of birds. But it seems that more could be said." "It could indeed, lord," said Merry. "For one thing," said Theoden, "I had not heard that they spouted smoke from their mouths." Of course, we have Merry and Pippin are smoking at that moment. So we see that hobbits are indeed quite elusive and have thus avoided the history books for thousands of years and have taken on this magical quality amongst the Rohirrim. Now, we know all three tribes migrated west over the Misty Mountains around 1050. That date is very important because that's the date that the Greenwood started to become known as Mirkwood. Sauron had returned to Dol Guldur, and that area is very close to the Vales of the Anduin. So this region became much less safe. There were raids happening, and the hobbits, for their own safety, decided we should go west. So the Harfoots, and later the Fallowhides, journey to a place called the Angle. The Angle is formed by two rivers. It's an area southwest of Rivendell, and they stay there for a while until the Witch King of Angmar becomes a thing, threatens them yet again. They move farther west, and in the year 1300 of the Third Age, they found Bree. It's later, a few hundred years later, when they get permission from the King of Arnor to colonize the Shire in 1601 of the Third Age. So again, Shire's not that old considering, the continent. But yeah, they come west around 1050, around 1300, they go farther west to Bree, and in 1600, they go to the Shire. So every 300 years, they keep going west. Now, the third tribe, the Stewars, took a different path. Some of them did journey to the Angle, along with the Harfoots and Fallowhides. So bits of all three tribes were hanging out there until they migrated to Bree. But most of the Stewars went south to Dunland. There they came in contact with the Dunlandings, and they stayed there for quite a while. It affected their speech, it changed their culture a bit. But eventually, once they heard about the Harfoots and Fallowhides settling in the Shire, they journeyed north and settled in the Shire as well. So by the mid-1600s of the Third Age, all three tribes are living together in harmony in the Shire. Now, those few Stewars that went to the Angle, when I mentioned the Witch King started threatening the region, and the Harfoots and Fallowhides went to Bree, those Stewars didn't go to Bree. Those Stewars decided, heck with this, we're going back to our old homeland. So instead of going west, they go east, back over the mountains, and they resettle back at their old homeland in the Gladden Fields area. And that happens, I believe it's 1356. They return to their homeland, the Gladden Fields. Now, whereas the other races, elves, men, dwarves, are defined a lot by the great battles they fought. Dagor Bragollach, the War of Wrath, the War of Dwarves and Orcs. The Hobbits do not have a warlike history. In fact, their history of war you can fit onto one page. So here's a quote about the long, illustrious history of wars fought by hobbits. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they have never fought amongst themselves. In olden days, they had, of course, been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world. But in Bilbo's time, that was very ancient history. The last battle before this story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory. The Battle of Greenfields, in which Bendebrus Took routed an invasion of orcs. So, though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, these were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or on walls. So there's a couple of things here that are interesting. Battle of Greenfields. That is fought in 2747 of the Third Age. And we originally see this in The Hobbit. And I would say it is probably the most intrinsically silly reference that Tolkien uses in his mythology, because he talks about how Bendebrus Took used a club and knocked the Goblin Lord's head off, flew 100 yards, fell into a rabbit hole, and thus the game of golf was created. The Goblin leader's name is Golfimble. So I guess if it had been Azog we'd all be playing Azog. We'd be going to the Azog course to take in 18 holes. I don't know. Anyway, it's a very little silly reference. Obviously, he was writing a kid's story at that time with The Hobbit. And we can put it up to it's not what really happened in Tolkien's mythology, that it's just the hobbits have created this little delightful tale about that. But it's just interesting that in the middle of the one defining battle with the hobbits, he talks about how it created the game of golf. But another important thing about that quote is that first line. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they have never fought amongst themselves. That is going to play into this idea of why they're so resistant to the ring. It is amazing that these three tribes all came together without any strife and formed this community in the Shire. That they basically fought twice. They had the Battle of Greenfields and the Battle of Bywater, which ends the War of the Ring. In both cases, they were fighting to defend their homeland. Both of them were victories. So we see that they're not just cowards. They prefer peace. When they're under strain in the Vales of the Anduin, there's a way out. Hey, if we go west, we can keep our way of life, and we don't have to have strife. They move. When they get threatened again by the Witch King hanging out at the angle, you know what? There's land to the west. Let's just go west. Well, once they reach the Shire, they can't go that farther west without going into the sea. So they make their stand. So we get this kind of a unique cultural quality about them that I think is there. They're not warlike. They prefer peace. But they do have their limits, but they will choose peace whenever possible. There's one other moment when we do see that they contribute to a war. It is not a war fought in the Shire. That is in 1975 of the Third Age, Battle of Fornost. That's where the Witch King is finally defeated by Glorfindel and Gondor. And according to the Shire, they sent Hobbit archers to aid in the defeat of the Witch King. So that would be the one other time that we see some kind of a military exercise amongst the Hobbits. But for the most part, yes, their history is not filled with wars, and I think that's kind of the point, the reason that they are able to resist the ring. A couple of other factors that make hobbits uniquely resistant to the ring, I think, are their resilience and their empathy. We see their resilience a few times. There's a great plague hits the Shire soon after it's colonized. It's 1637. Great plague has been moving west. It hits the Shire. Very devastating for the community. They get through it. Obviously a little relevant to today's events, why I'm sitting here in this room. Later, we see the Long Winter. That hits about 10 or 11 years after the Battle of Greenfields. The crops go away, there's starvation, there's death, and again, there's this resilience and a willingness to help each other, this community, these three tribes that have come together and are looking out for the common good, that empathy. And actually, it's in the Long Winter that Gandalf first takes notice of hobbits. We have this quote from Gandalf in the Unfinished Tales. And then there was the Shire folk. I began to have a warm place in my heart for them in the long winter, which none of you can remember. They were very hard put to it then. One of the worst pinches they've been in, dying of cold and starving in the dreadful dearth that followed. But that was the time to see their courage and their pity one for another. It was by their pity, as much as by their tough, uncomplaining courage, that they survived. That pity, what I'm calling empathy, I think is definitely something that hobbits have in spades that a lot of these other races perhaps could borrow from. And in fact, we see that reflected in this very moving moment from the end of The Hobbit. This is where Thorin is dying, and it's his dying words to Bilbo as Bilbo mourns the loss of his friend. Bilbo knelt on one knee, filled with sorrow. "Farewell, King under the mountain," he said. "This is a bitter adventure, if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils, That has been more than any Baggins deserves." "No," said Thorin. "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." So here he is on his deathbed. He kind of realizes perhaps some of the failings of himself and maybe, his dwarven culture in general, how they were so obsessed with this lust for gold, and perhaps even dismissed the hobbits as not wanting power and gold. And it's at this moment that he gets to reflect. And he says, it's actually your love of the simpler things, food, cheer, and song, friendship, that elevate the hobbits. And here we see Bilbo showing that empathy. Thorin had been kind of mean to him in the recent past, but he was still terribly sad to see what he considered his friend, dying before him. And it's that empathy that eventually helps win the day in this extended War of the Ring. Another great example of this empathy comes about in The Lord of the Rings. It's Gandalf talking to Frodo. And you will probably recognize some of these sentences because they make their way into the Fellowship of the Ring, the movie. We begin with Frodo speaking. "What am I to do? What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance. Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity." "I'm sorry," said Frodo, "but I'm frightened, and I do not feel any pity for Gollum." "You have not seen him," Gandalf broke in. "No, and I don't want to," said Frodo. "Now, at any rate, he's as bad as an orc and just an enemy. He deserves death." "Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death. Some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment. For even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least." "All the same," said Frodo, "even if Bilbo could not kill Gollum, I wish he had not kept the ring. I wish he had never found it, and that I'd not got it. Why did you let me keep it? Why didn't you make me throw it away or destroy it?" "Let you? Make you?" said the wizard. "Haven't you been listening at all to what I've said? But as for throwing it away, that was obviously wrong. These rings have a way of being found. In evil hands, it might have done great evil. Worst of all, it might have fallen into the hands of the enemy. Indeed, it certainly would, for this is the one, and he is exerting all his power to find it or draw it to himself." So I liked that notion that it was, Bilbo's state of mind when he acquired the ring helped him ward off its evil influence. The word pity comes up many, many times in that dialogue. Now, there is a theory out there. I've seen this on Reddit, and it can be a compelling theory at times. I personally don't believe in it, but there's a theory that the hobbits were essentially a creation of Iluvatar to be a weapon against the ring. And the evidence for that would be that, first of all, Tolkien doesn't write about hobbits until 1050, which is when Sauron shows up in Dol Guldur, which is also around the time that Gandalf and company are being sent by the Valar to counter Sauron. The fact that it's Daigle who finds the ring, a hobbit, killed immediately by Smeagol, another hobbit, who takes it, hides away for 500 years. The ring is found by another hobbit, Uh, that hobbit gives it to another hobbit. When Frodo's in trouble, it's Sam, another hobbit, that takes it temporarily, gives it back to Frodo. It's eventually Sméagol, the hobbit, falls into the volcano. And so the ring constantly finds itself in the hands of these non-power seeking, non-warlike, empathetic creatures. So the thought is that this is all part of a grand design, that the hobbits were placed there to be at the right place at the right time, do a little handoff with the ring, and eventually destroy it. And so Iluvatar had this incredibly complex plot. It's not impossible, but I am not a big fan of this. Partially, it does seem so convoluted. You know, as we see in the hobbits almost certainly awoke with the first men way back in the day. And they had thousands of years of existence before the ring was even forged, much less 1050 of the Third Age. Seems like there would be easier ways that Iluvatar could have come up with to counter the ring than this incredibly complex plot of hobbitdom. Also, I'll say this. Let's assume for a second that Iluvatar did make this plan. And he's a bit of a dick. I mean, think what he did to Sméagol. If that was his plan, it was like, all right, Sméagol, you're going to be my Job, essentially, right? You're going to be driven to kill your cousin. You're going to take the ring. You're going to get shunned by your community. You're going to go away into a cave for 500 years. Can't die. You're going to get warped, though. You're going to be miserable every day, alone. You won't see sunlight. Eventually, I will come and the ring will be taken from you. But that's not the end of your pain, because you're going to be driven by an insatiable need to get it. So you're going to go out, try to track it down. You're going to get captured. You're going to get tortured. Eventually, you're going to get back to the ring. And at the very end, when another hobbit who I've chosen can't finish the journey, I want you to bite his finger off. Then you're going to fall into a volcano and perish. Your body will be destroyed in lava. And so whereas the other hobbit ring bearers all get to go to the Undying Lands as kind of a last reward for them, you won't. Like, whoa! That is a curse that rivals Morgoth's curse of Húrin and his family, if that's the case. This is how I'm going to counter the ring. I'm going to put the worst curse ever on this hapless steward hanging out in the Gladden fields. Like, whoo! That is mean. That's mean stuff. Much less what he did to Frodo. So anyway, I don't really ascribe to this notion that they are merely an instrument of Iluvatar to counter the ring. But if you were a conspiracy theorist, you can find quotes that seem to suggest the events happening are being controlled by this higher power. I'm going to read you one or two of those, just to throw these out there. I think these quotes tend to cut both ways, because in one hand it'll show you that, oh, maybe the higher power was pushing things along. But at the same time, it shows you the innate cultural traits of hobbits that allow them to resist the corrupting influence of the ring. This is from Lord of the Rings. A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most, he plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care. And that only at an early stage, when it first begins to grip. But as far as I know, Bilbo alone in history has ever gone beyond playing and really done it. And he needed all my help, too. And even so, he would never have just forsaken it or cast it aside. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decided things. The ring left him. What? Just in time to meet Bilbo? Said Frodo. Wouldn't an orc have suited it better? It is no laughing matter, said Gandalf. Not for you. It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far. Bilbo's arrival just at that time, and putting his hand on it blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. Then, when a chance came, it caught poor Daigle, and he was murdered. And after that, Gollum, and it had devoured him. It could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean, and as long as it stayed with him, he would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when his master was awake once more and sending out his dark thought from Mirkwood, it abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the Ringmaker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, not by its maker, in which case you were also meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought. Again, some of those quotes might be familiar to you if you've just watched the movies, because Peter Jackson obviously thought they were relevant to the theme of the movies. This idea that dark and trying times can be resolved as much by peaceful everymen, as much as great heroes. People doing the right things, people having empathy in the right moments can make a big difference. But again, if you were a conspiracy theorist, this idea that there was something else at work beyond any design of the Ringmaker, a la some power countering Sauron, that put Bilbo into the cave at the right time, that's where you can see some of that text come out. And you see a hint of it at the very end of The Hobbit. When Bilbo has finished all of his journeys, he's hearing what happened after the Battle of the Five Armies, and he's talking with Gandalf. "Then the prophecies of the old songs have turned out to be true after a fashion," said Bilbo. "Of course," said Gandalf. "And why should they not prove true? Surely you don't disbelieve the prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck, just for your sole benefit? You are a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I am very fond of you. But you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world after all." "Thank goodness," said Bilbo, laughing, and handed him the tobacco jar. And this idea that it's not luck. There's a grand design at work, pushing things along in The Hobbit as well as in Lord of the Rings. And, I mean, to some extent, obviously, Iluvatar created hobbits. And perhaps there is a bit of, moving pieces on a chessboard to the nature of the events that occurred. But I stopped short at saying that they were created for one purpose in mind. This is my tool to use against the ring. I don't think that was what was in the grand design of Iluvatar. So, Samir, I hope that answers your question about a little brief history of the hobbits, why perhaps they are resistant to the ring. We're going to turn our attention now to Dale Pride's question about Gladden Fields. I've already brought up Gladden Fields in reference to the Stewars, but just to give you a little history of that, because it does really impact the ring and the history of Middle-earth as we know it. The first folks to settle in the Gladden Fields region would be the Nandor elves. This is way back in the years of the trees, before the First Age. The elves do their own awakening, much like men did, and they journey west, much like men later did. When they hit the Misty Mountains, kind of just like the hobbits, the Nandor elves decide, I think we've gone far enough as well. I don't want to go over those mountains. We're going to stay here. So they do the same thing. It's just many years before the hobbits would have. In fact, I believe the name Nandor means those who go back. So they, you guys go ahead, we'll stay here. Eventually, parts of the Nandor elves become the Sylvan elves that we know that take up residence in Lorien and in Greenwood. Kittelor has joined us. Hopefully she will be quiet for the duration. Good girl. Oh, there's your tail. Boop, boop. Okay. I was just talking about Gladden Fields, Kittelor. I hope you don't mind. So the Gladden Fields are so named because they have... well done. Because they have yellow irises that grow there, Gladdens. And so Gladden Fields, you can imagine just yellow flowers growing everywhere. Oh, man. Okay, I got cat hair all up my nose. Woo! We've got elves. They've settled there. In later years, the Northmen set up generally in that region. And we now fast forward to the year 2 of the Third Age. Huge moment in the history of Middle-earth happens. I've done a video on it if you want to check it out. So I'm going to avoid trying to read the same quotes that I used for that video. The disaster of Gladden Fields. I'll give you a quick summary because it's incredibly relevant. So this is after the War of the Last Alliance. Elendil was killed by Sauron. Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand, takes the ring. A couple of years go by. He's making sure the kingdom is well off, and he's now returning to Rivendell for a couple of reasons. One, because that's where his wife and his youngest son are living with Elrond. And two, because he's decided, I need to give this ring away. I need to give Elrond this ring to do with as he chooses. Elrond's already advocated, like, maybe we should destroy this ring. And Isildur has resisted, because it's corrupting him. But he's kind of relented, at least in this moment. When I get to Rivendell, I'm giving Elrond the ring. So the notion is perhaps that the ring realizes it's in peril and is trying to reach out, and it pulls a bunch of orcs from that region to attack Isildur and company. Isildur has a small army with him. They're routed by they're outnumbered 10-1 by orcs. And it's terrible because Isildur and 3 of his 4 sons are all killed in this disaster of Gladden Fields. It's a terrible moment for the history of Gondor and Arnor. I'm going to read you a passage from the Unfinished Tales that is describing Isildur's run. His forces have been routed. He's been forced to leave his sons behind as he's running away. He puts the ring on, takes off, and it's really touching. This moment when the ring leaves him, I thought was particularly moving. Isildur turned west, and drawing up the ring that hung in a wallet from a fine chain about his neck, he set it upon his finger with a cry of pain, and was never seen again by any eye upon Middle-earth. But the Elendilmere of the west could not be quenched, and suddenly it blazed forth red and wrathful as a burning star. Men and orcs gave way in fear, and Isildur, drawing a hood over his head, vanished into the night. Now, of Isildur it is told that he was in great pain and anguish of heart, but at first he ran like a stag from the hounds, until he came to the bottom of the valley. There he halted, to make sure that he was not pursued, for orcs could track a fugitive in the dark by scent, and needed no eyes. Then he went on more warily, for wide flats stretched on into the gloom before him, rough and pathless, with many traps for wandering feet. So it was that he came at last to the banks of Anduin in the dead of night, and he was weary, for he had made a journey that the Dunedain on such ground could have made no quicker, marching without halt and by day. The river was swirling dark and swift before him. He stood for a while alone and in despair. Then in haste he cast off all his armor and weapons, save a short sword at his belt, and he plunged into the water. He was a man of strength and endurance that few even of the Dunedain of that age could equal, but he had little hope to gain the other shore. Before he had gone far, he was forced to turn almost north against the current, and strive as he might, he was ever swept down towards the tangles of the Gladden Fields. They were nearer than he had thought, and even as he felt the stream slacken, and it almost won across, he found himself struggling among great rushes and clinging weeds. There suddenly he knew that the ring had gone. By chance, or chance well used, it had left his hand and gone where he could never hope to find it again. At first, so overwhelming was his sense of loss that he struggled no more and would have sunk and drowned. But swift as it had come, the mood passed. The pain had left him. A great burden had been taken away. His feet found the riverbed, and heaving himself up out of the mud, he floundered through the reeds close to the western shore. There he rose up out of the water, only a mortal man, a small creature lost and abandoned in the wilds of Middle-earth. But to the night-eyed orcs that lurked there on the watch, he loomed up, a monstrous shadow of fear, with a piercing eye like a star. They loosed their poisoned arrows at it and fled. Needlessly, for Isildur, unarmed, was pierced through heart and throat, and without a cry he fell back into the water. No trace of his body was ever found by elves or men. So passed the first victim of the malice of the Masterless Ring. Isildur, second king of all the Dunedain, lord of Arnor and Gondor, and in that age of the world, the last. Oh, wow. Oh, that moment, the one where it says, the ring's gone. He's like, oh my God, the ring's gone. And he's so depressed that he contemplates suicide. But then this relief hits him, and for a few moments, he is removed of the burden of the ring. And it's just so heartbreaking that it's then right shortly after that he's violently killed. But he does feel this moment of, I would imagine, supreme joy at not having the burden of the ring anymore before he is struck down. And so that is where the ring falls into the river, and our good friend Daigle finds it 2,500 years later-ish. And then, of course, Smeagol takes it from there. So when the ring is found by Daigle, it is incredibly fortuitous because the hunt is on. 2460 of the Third Age is when Sauron, who'd been kicked out of Dol Guldur, returns to Dol Guldur. And one of his main missions is find the ring. He knows that Gladden Fields, nearby, is probably where the ring is, and he sends out his spies to look for it. But it's 2463, Daigle finds it, Smeagol kills him for it, Smeagol takes the ring to the Misty Mountains, so that by the time Sauron is officially really scouring the area looking for the ring, it's gone. Same thing with Saruman. So Saruman is aware that Sauron's looking for it. He sends out his spies. Radagast unwittingly is helping him with the birds and beasts of the land, trying to spy for the ring. And what we find out is, and I mentioned this in that other video, but again, it's worthy of bringing up here. Saruman came achingly close to getting the ring. Now, we don't know exactly when he ended up finding what he found, but somewhere along the lines, he almost certainly found Isildur's body. Because after the War of the Ring, when Aragorn and Gimli and company take over Orthanc, they find this secret room filled with artifacts that Saruman has collected. And among those artifacts, there's two items. One is the necklace that Isildur kept the ring on. And the second thing is the Elendomir. So that gem that's glowing red that they talk about, that even when he's invisible, this red gem is glowing. He had it on him when he was shot. And that item, which disappeared for 3,000 years, turns up in this little vault that Saruman had. So Saruman found the Elendomir and the necklace that held the ring. Those two things were almost certainly on Isildur's body, and yet he didn't bury Isildur. He never was like, hey, I found stuff. He never told anybody. He probably just tossed the bones. And I don't know. Who knows what he did with Isildur's body, but he certainly didn't bury it. It shows a lot of that evil deviousness of Saruman, but also how close he came, perhaps. Now, obviously, the ring wasn't on Isildur, but it would have been pretty nearby. And you feel like, given enough time, Saruman probably maybe finds it faster than Sauron even does. But thank you, Smeagol, because you took the ring to Misty Mountains. So that kind of ended that chapter of the disaster of Gladden Fields. The whole line of Elendil practically got bumped off, except for this kid, Valendil, who was hanging out at Rivendell, becomes the king, but he's like 12 years old at the time. So just to go forward in time from there, that was the year 2 of the Third Age. Really, next thing of note is that 1356 of the Third Age. That's when the Stewards return to Gladden Fields. They had left it in 1050. They return 300 years later. So about 500 years later, 1856, there's a big battle nearby the Battle of the Plains. The Wayne Riders defeat the good guys and are Eotheod, precursor to the Rohirrim, are driven out and seek refuge in the vales of the Anduin, including the Gladdenfields region. They're joined by refugees from Mirkwood, and our Eotheod create a society in that area. As I mentioned, 2460, Sauron returns to Dol Guldur, starts looking for the ring. 2463 at the Gladdenfields, that's where Dagul finds the ring. Smeagol kills him for it. And the last event of note, I think, that includes the region of the Gladdenfields is 2510. It's the Battle of the Field of Celebrant. Current steward of Gondor is Cirion. Cirion is fighting a war against the Balchoth Easterlings. And it's a touch-and-go situation. You could say he's losing. He's desperate. He calls for aid from the Eotheod. Just to skip to the end for a second, the Eotheod do answer the call. They help Cirion to an impressive victory over the Balchoth, and as a reward, they are given Rohan and become the Rohirrim. This is the defining moment that turns them into the Rohirrim. But it involves another perilous journey through Gladdenfields, basically being chased by orcs, involving people getting killed off. So it's not exactly like the disaster of Gladdenfields. In fact, it has a victorious end to it. But there's a certain still sense of that same peril. So maybe don't go through Gladdenfields if you're on your way to do a mission. Maybe go around. I don't know. Anyway. But so I'm going to read you this passage. This is from Unfinished Tales. And it describes this thing. So Cirion, desperate. He's sending out riders in waves to try to get to the Eotheod. But they have to go through enemy territory. That enemy territory includes the Gladdenfields area. Very dangerous. Very little hope of success. But one guy gets through. All right. In this peril, Cirion's thought turned at last in desperation to the Eotheod, and he determined to send messengers to them. But they would have to go through lands already watched and patrolled by the Balchoth. This would mean a ride of some 450 miles to the Undeeps, and more than 500 thence to the Eotheod. And from the Undeeps they would be forced to go warily and mostly by night until they had passed the shadow of Dol Guldur. Cirion had little hope that any of them would get through. He called for volunteers, and choosing 6 riders of great courage and endurance, he set them out in pairs with a day's interval between them. Each bore a message learned by heart, and also a small stone incised with the seal of the stewards, that he should deliver to the lord of the Eotheod in person, if he succeeded in reaching that land. The message was addressed to Iorl, son of Leod, for Cirion knew that he had succeeded his father some years before. Yet Cirion had but faint hope that even if the message were received, it would be answered. He had no claim on the Eotheod beyond their ancient friendship with Gondor to bring them so far away with any strength that would avail. The first pair of messengers left on the 10th day of Sulime, and in the event it was one of these, alone of all the 6, who got through to the Eotheod. He was Borondir, a great rider of a family that claimed descent from a captain of the Northmen in the service of the kings of old. Of the others no tidings were ever heard, save of Borondir's companion. He was slain by arrows in ambush as they passed near Dol Guldur, from which Borondir escaped by fortune and the speed of his horse. He was pursued as far north as the Gladdenfields, and often waylaid by men that came out of the forest and forced him to ride far out of the direct way. He came at last to the Eotheod after 15 days, for the last 2 without food, and he was so spent that he could scarce speak his message to Iorl. It was then the 25th day of Sulime. Iorl took counsel with himself in silence, but not for long. Soon he rose, and he said, I will come. If the Munberg falls, whither shall we flee from the darkness? Then he took Borondir's hand in token of his promise. His name was long remembered in song as Borondir Udalralf, Borondir the Stirrupless. for he rode back at the right hand of Yorl, and was the first to cross the limelight and cleave a path to the aid of Cirion. He fell at last on the field of Celebrant, defending his lord, to the great grief of Gondor and the Eotheod, and was afterwards laid in tomb in the hallows of Minas Tirith. So that's a great story. Boy, you could see a movie of that, couldn't you? But yeah, so Barandir, he's one of 6 riders. He's one of the first 2 to go out, and he's the only one who makes it through the orcs. He arrives, gives the message to Yorl. Yorl steps up to the plate. They return through the Gladden Fields region, now with, a cavalry. So they have less to fear, I guess, of the, marauding orcs. They get to the battle in time, save the day. But in that battle, Barandir is killed. And there is a song about him. And he is laid to rest, in the hallows of Minas Tirith. So this is a hero. Saves Gondor. So Gladden Fields saw a lot of violence and played a lot of part in the history of Middle-earth in the Third Age. It's important to note that, if Gondor had failed there against the Balchoth, they may not have been around at later, hundreds of years later, to fight in the War of the Ring. So that was actually a really crucial moment, perhaps, in the success of the War of the Ring as well. So we can see there Gladden Fields playing a part in the War of the Ring. So there you have it. The history of hobbits, how they are so resistant to the ring, and a little history of Gladden Fields and the part it played in the War of the Ring. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Samir and Dale, for sending in those comments. If you've got a topic you'd like me to talk about, please put it in the comments. I'd be happy to do a video about a topic of your choosing. Thanks so much, everybody. Stay safe out there.